Welcome back, public education advocates. It's the Ask Dr. Be Good show where we share the practice, the pedagogy, and the politics currently happening in public education. As always, I ask that you write your name in the comments when you come in, and then let me know your thoughts and any questions you have about the topic that we're discussing. You know, I was a classroom teacher for 13 years, so I like having an actively participating group to just share back and forth what's happening in our conversation. Even if you listen later, you can still pop in your questions because I'll get notified and then I'll be able to answer you and continue the conversation with you. So let's get started. Today, just as a reminder, because it's a recent happening, I've gone to the 30-minute podcast format, and that allows me to do a couple things. One is to really concentrate on two current items in public education, and then also save 30 minutes for a second show that we'll be starting to do in July. John Payton and I, who will be coming on and joining me because I love to debate topics with him. He and I will be doing a health and wellness show called Saving the World Through Health and Wellness, and that's coming soon. So let's get started. John Payton, you want to pop in and show yourself? How are you? Welcome. And again, I asked you to come on for a couple of reasons. The first segment, we're going to talk about the CRT, critical race theory, and the impact it's having on parents, school districts, and school boards all over the country. And I probably should say legislative sessions as well, because there's been action there. But I was on 5 radio shows this morning, and that came up, and I liked the dialogue that I had with the radio hosts, and so I hated to just come on and talk about it without getting some feedback from somebody like you who is intelligent and very interested in what is happening in public education. So let's talk about that. The thing that triggered the conversation on the radio today was the fact that Loudoun, Virginia, in Virginia County had some disruptive parents at the school board meeting last night. And part of it was about, one was critical race theory, and the other one was trying to pass a policy around transgender students and what pronouns to use with them. So this is not the only place that a lot of emotion has been generated around critical race theory. And so I know I just saw Iowa has voted to not allow the teaching of critical race theory in schools. Let me ask, John, are you pretty familiar now with critical race theory?
Absolutely, and I've read quite a bit on it, and understand it, and know that from the point of view of Texas, Texas more or less has legislated CRT out of the classroom. Now, they haven't called it CRT, but the language that they used would definitely be in conflict with what CRT is trying to teach. So, but to answer your question directly, yes, I've read up on it now, and still reading even more.
One of the things that I am surprised about CRT is the fact that it's not being divulged that I know of, unless you can share sources that have, that CRT is not really about race. It's about class, right?
It's all about class. It's about subdividing people up into economic classes. And again, I've talked about this before, even on my show. You go back to the Rawlsian theory of 90% of the people owning 10% of the resources and 10% of the people owning 90% of the resources. And that's what CRT is. CRT is a Marxist, very clearly economic Marxist plan to create a very controllable population by a very small number of people. It's when you really dig into it, it has almost nothing to do with race, but with class. And it's amazing how we're using disciples of Black Lives Matter, disciples of other organizations that are really trying to promote equity, that may not have dived in or have driven into what CRT really is, and using them as pawns. One of the things that came out today, and I thought this was interesting, at the Loudoun County School Board's meeting, was that you had one lady on the far side that had a black shirt on that said Black Lives Matter, and she's about 50 years old. Then you had a 50-year-old man on the other side wearing Make America Great Again. Mm. And I mean, it was clearly polarized, and they both come in with all of their own ideas on how things should go. And instead of it being really about what's best for the children and what does this really mean. So very interesting what's going on out there.
Well, I shared with one of the radio hosts, because they asked me what did I think about the fact that these parents got so upset, and the superintendent sort of, they shut down the meeting, right? They voted unanimously to cut off the speakers when they had about 51 of the 250 speakers who had signed up to speak. After 51 speakers, they just shut her down, and that's when the trouble started. They're trying to get them to go home, but it was my opinion, because they said, why do you think there's been such a bad reaction from the superintendent and the school board? And I frankly told them, because parents haven't been showing up, right? The school board and the parents have been allowed by the parents to function at that level with very little oversight from the parents. And all of a sudden now, between critical race theory and the transgender issue, they have caused parents to come down and start really voicing their opinion, when in fact, this should have been clearly articulated before the board meeting to parents. And so I know you probably will agree with me that you've seen superintendents get a little maybe arrogant or blasé around the communication needed to inform parents of upcoming issues, and then they're surprised when parents get emotional over something where they feel blindsided. Haven't you seen that?
I have. I'm really surprised that I've read about this today on JP Cathy and the Crew. One of our titles was Louder in Loudoun County. And so I've done a ton of research on this, and it's interesting that it doesn't seem like Loudoun County School Board held any community meetings at like the elementary schools or the middle schools within the community to have that discussion and let those 259 people air out before you ever go to a school board meeting, that discussion, because then you generally can create coalitions within those groups. So when I've seen a superintendent back away from something and allow it to develop, rather than let's get them oopsie on the school board meeting kind of deal, then I find that they join coalitions. And so instead of having 259 speakers, you'll have 3 or 4 speakers from the coalitions that will come forward, because then those coalitions will go meet with themselves and come up with their battle plans, and then go to the board meeting. And instead of 259 angry people, you've got this that's already been out there, it's already been discussed. The anger is already in the air and out and over, and now it's time to get to the business of educating children. That did not happen in Loudoun County, or at least they're not purporting that has happened in Loudoun County.
Matter of fact, as you were talking, I became aware of the fact that board members should have treated some of these issues like they do when they want a bond passed. You know what the process is when a big district wants a bond passed. Oh my gosh, they've got forums that they hold at the schools, and they do this over a series of several months, and they meet with the chamber. They will meet with different churches so that they can explain the need for the money that the bond would bring into the school if it were passed by the voters. And so that same sort of protocol, I think, would have been wise to use around some of these issues, instead of just putting it on the agenda and some people catching wind of it, which is what happened. So
now it didn't make any sense, because they're not voting on any of this till August the 10th. So why do it in a board meeting? That's what never made any sense to me. Why not spend June and July in the community? And I'm going to use an overused word, get your stakeholders to come in. And then when they do come in on the board meeting and they didn't show up to any of those other community-based meetings, you can say, well, where have you been for 2 months? We've been discussing this in the community for 2 months. Where have you been?
Right.
So they take that away from themselves, knowing they're not going to vote till August the 10th. So it made no sense to me. In the real spark, here's what's interesting. It's almost like CRT is beginning to take a back seat to this transgender question of privacy in bathrooms, transgender rights. Like, I didn't know transgenders had rights. I thought that every American had rights. And so I'm a little confused about that. There being a subsection of the Constitution that applies to transgenders only. And it wasn't until the seventh speaker when she got up and she said, I have a transgender child, and that child wants to be referred to as, and then started to attack Christians in the room, and that Jesus wasn't in the room, and where's the compassion? And that's what lit the fire. It was like a keg of dynamite blew up, arrests took place. And so it's almost like CRT took a back seat to transgenderism and calling me a pronoun, which if I was a teacher in Loudoun County, no offense, Dr. Good, I don't think that I could maintain a pronoun relationship with a student because I wouldn't remember.
Well, now the courts have already, a school district fired a teacher for refusing to use the pronoun that the child wanted, and the courts actually decided for the teacher. So that's already starting to happen where, most teachers might use the pronoun that the student wanted, but for whatever reason, this teacher refused to do that. And the court made the district rehire him after his firing. So there's a lot of stuff going on. And I tell you, when I hear about transgender stuff, the schools have figured it out, folks. Not the athletic piece, not that. But as far as the bathroom piece, we never went to our legislators and said, help us with this. I promise, we never did. We've had transgender students always, and we have figured it out in most of the districts. In those districts, the one or two in the country that couldn't seem to work with a child, that usually ended up in a court situation. And then that we heard about it. But for most schools, we're there to educate kids. We're not there to get into their body business. And so, and I'll tell you, I had transgender kids, and they were treated like any other kid. And if they, needed to figure out the bathroom thing, they got with the principal and they did it. It's so, sometimes people legislators make things their agendas that were not put on their agenda by schools.
Well, a student could go use the nurse's office bathroom in privacy if there was a concern for that. Because I've had that discussion on many other different fronts, like a student who has real bad intestinal issues, right? Because we can't account for him for 3 hours during the day. We have him go to the school nurse so he can use the restroom in the school nurse's office. So there's ways around that. I think where state legislatures jump into it, one, it becomes a political issue. Two, it's a use of public funds and public property. And so I think that's where they think they should jump in. Again, here's why I question that. 0.5% to 1% at most identify as transgenders in this country. That means 99.5 to 99% of the country, they don't identify that way. And so what are we really doing here? I'm all about John Stuart Mills and utilitarianism. I talked about that this morning, where the minority has a voice. Even that 0.5, that minority voice, though, needs to be, like you said, one-on-one with the principal. Go in and meet with your counselor. Find a private solution. One of the comments made last night in Loudoun County, and I agree with this, is transgender is a home conversation, not a public school conversation. And we had one of the people from the crew pipe on and say that her fifth grader heard about the differences in people at school, not at home. And that she explained to her child, we're not transgender, we're not heterosexual, we're not homosexual, we're Americans. And we just all see each other as Americans. And so, again, what are we doing? Are we going too far? Are we having these conversations in the schoolhouse when they really should be happening at home?
Well, that was the ultimate message that I left every single show this morning, all 5 of them. Ultimately, I said it's the responsibility of the parent to keep track of what's happening in the school. If you don't, if you don't go to meetings, if you don't ask questions of the teacher, if you don't ask your child what they're learning in school, then you don't really get to complain, right?
Right.
And so that ultimately you have to do your parental duty and stay informed and stay focused on what's happening in the place that where the child spends most of his or her time 5 days a week. So um, ultimately it's a parent responsibility. But we have so much flux going on, and now, speaking of flux, we have this ruling by the Supreme Court for the National Collegiate Amateur Athlete, which sort of opens the door to amateur athletes, receiving what they call educational benefits for their athletic work in the universities. It doesn't go as far as to say that they can get compensated, although one has to wonder if that's sort of opening the door. But now they can recruit students with promises of other things that, besides room and board, besides the standard scholarship, internships, travel abroad, other enticements, so that they can recruit the better athletes to their university. How do you feel about that? Because you're a big sports guy. That's why I wanted you to be on and talk about that.
And I am, and I get really confused because a lot of those things you just mentioned are already a part of our college system, away from college athletics. I had a friend of mine who went to University of Dallas, and he went to Rome to study abroad for 2 semesters, and then came back. And so I don't understand, and that wasn't paid for by him. The university sent him over, and then they sent students from Rome over. And so, outside of his spending money, and when he had like a weekend off or something where he would go jump the train, pretty much he had dorm, room, or board while he was there and went to school. And so a lot of it, I don't understand where it's an enticement. One of the big things, and you haven't mentioned this yet in that article, was that the NCAA is a business and it should be treated as a business, but it's not a business. That's why it's the National Collegiate College Athletic Association, is because it's there for the 1,268 member universities to provide a fair and equitable source for athletics in the universities. Students go into the NCAA knowing that they're not going to get paid, knowing that they're an amateur sport. They understand that this may lead to the big leagues and be able to make it to the pro levels. One of my other arguments is, if you think you got it and you want it, then go try out at the pro level. Go to the NFL Combine. Into the NBA, Sean Kemp, straight out of high school. Kobe Bryant, straight out of high school, that went into professional sports. And a lot of these organizations now have development leagues to then push you into the pros. I think that with something like this, all you're doing is potentially hurting the impoverished, is all you're doing. Because it then changes up your selection, because now you're going to be offering X number of dollars to come join our university. And then what do you do with that, right? Let's say the NCAA makes $5 billion off of basketball, baseball, and football. Does the NCAA now have a responsibility to disperse that to Division 1, 2, and 3? Do you leave that money just for Division 1 players because they're the ones getting the big TV contracts? I mean, and stadiums run themselves.
Well, right now, the ruling isn't for compensation. It's for allowing other enticements. But they're basing it on the fact that they feel that the NCAA makes way too much money, and they're making it off the backs of mostly kids of color from poor backgrounds. And so it's interesting that you should say that it's going to hurt the impoverished child, when in fact they thought that they had the impoverished child in mind when they did this ruling.
No, I mean, you take a student, for example, a student athlete like the quarterback from Clemson. His family could afford to send him to college, student loans or what have you. He didn't have a problem getting into testing. He may have had a better high school, right? May have had better teachers. Maybe he had just a better system, right? And then others that had to claw their way in from an inner city. And it could be white, black, or Hispanic student, because again, I look at it more like a class issue than anything else, right? The student that attends Clemson as the head quarterback probably has more experience with travel with their family, more cultural background, whereas others are locked into the local Joe Pool and home, and that's all they get all summer long. They don't get to experience the battlegrounds of West Virginia of Virginia. They don't get to experience the beaches of California or the marinas in California or the whaling ships, or not whaling ships, but the crabbing ships up in Boston. Or, they don't get to have the history of this country brought to them by them going out and seeing it, living it, and breathing it. Anyways, I go too long. My point is that if they start paying students, then are we changing the caliber of student now? Versus, hey, here's a college scholarship. We understand you had a struggle with the testing. We're going to take your background into effect, let you into college, and now you can earn your way to getting a 4-year degree and even potentially a master's degree in 6. Because a lot of universities offer that. And there are a lot of student athletes that take advantage of that. They know they're never going to make it to the pros. And so they get into a bachelor master's program so that when they're done with their college scholarship, they walk out of school with a master's degree.
So it's interesting, though, that this it wasn't voted by party lines. This was a 9-0 opinion.
Right. I'm shocked.
And I'm wondering if it's possibly the comparison of the money that the NCAA folks make versus who's making the money for them, the impoverished child. The president of the NCAA earns $4 million annually, while commissioners at the top conferences take home between $2 and $5 million. College athlete directors average more than $1 million annually, and salaries for top Division I college football coaches approaches $11 million, with some of their assistants making more than $2.5 million. But the student athletes who generate the revenues, many of who are African American and from lower income backgrounds, end up with little or nothing, Kavanaugh wrote. Nowhere else in America can businesses get away with agreeing not to pay their workers a fair market rate on the theory that their product is defined by not paying their workers a fair market rate. And under ordinary principles of antitrust laws, it's not evident why college sports should be any different. The NCAA is not above the law. So,
see, again, I disagree with that. I think, take your Division I schools, right? Right now, 4 years of education is costing you $120,000. $120,000. If I want to go to Texas Tech University, I'm going to pay $120,000 for room, board, classes, tuition, and books. That's what's going to happen.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. Now, take these guys that are playing football. These guys are getting to travel all over their conference for free. They're getting to go to different parts of the country. When I was doing speech and debate for Collin College, I convinced them to let me compete on the Division I 4-year level, not the junior college level. And I got to go to Alabama. I got to go to the University of Louisiana Monroe, which you're thinking to yourself, okay, John, yeah, but I've never been there before. I got to experience it, right? California, Berkeley, Harvard University, Ateneo University in the Philippines. I got to go to Oxford University, Cambridge University in London. And so I got to go and do all that at the expense of the school. And when these guys are playing football, it's all at the expense of the school, the trainers, the medical staff, the athletic facilities, and they get to go and showcase who they are and get an education. I think the NCAA is giving them an opportunity to show themselves off to professional scouts, to potentially get themselves into the pros later on and use college as a development, which is what college is for. It's that development of who you are between high school and the real world. And it gives you an opportunity to develop. And so when you're paying them $120,000, which is pretty much a 4-year full ride scholarship, including room, board, tuition, and books, I think that is a payment. And yeah, okay, these coaches get paid a lot. Here's what we're not saying. The commissioner of the NCAA may make $4 million, but he's also in charge of 1,268 member universities. And how many sports? You've got female sports, male sports. His responsibilities are probably worth multi-hundred millions of dollars. You take these guys in charge of conferences. They have how many schools in their conferences? Look at the Big 12, right? And so, and that's a lot to have to manage. Should they make $2 million? Heck yeah, they should make $2 million a year. I don't want their $2 million headache that they're going to get, and their high blood pressure and their heart condition, no matter how much they run, no matter how much they eat well, because of the stress. Because we know stress can kill a body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you take the head coach. Take OU, for example. Take Texas, University of Texas, Texas A&M. Those guys are expected to produce not just athletes, but they're to produce academic athletes. And so they've got to make sure that the tutors are where they're supposed to be, the assistant coaches are doing what they're supposed to be, making sure the team is represented right, making sure that all the dots are crossed and all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. That job's worth $11 million. The assistant coach is in charge of keeping track of everybody and making sure that everything's running the way it's supposed to. I don't have a problem with the salaries. Not at all. It's a huge operation. And so I don't have a problem with it.
You think maybe the judges just weren't truly familiar with all the work tasks that are involved in those job descriptions, and they just looked at the money and not the responsibilities? I mean, 9-0.
Well, my guess would be that there were, and I haven't read the case yet, and I'm going to go read the case. But my understanding, if I were looking at this, it comes down to the arguments of the lawyers. What did the lawyers argue? Did they argue a practical approach to this? I would have had a section of my argument and my written response that would have addressed the practical approach of having to run 1,268 member universities, having to run the Big 12, the Big East, where all that TV money's going. Yeah, okay, we're paying salaries, but we're paying salaries to people that have huge responsibilities. Who maintains the facilities? Can you imagine walking into the University of Texas and their football stadium having aluminum seating on both sides and they can seat 500 people? Give me a break. Allen ISD has an $89 million football stadium, and that's high school.
Yeah. So they did vote it this way. What do you predict will happen? What do you think this is going to go well? Is it how will it change sports?
Well, I think that this definitely casts a whole new outlook on compensation. And I think that conversation now kicks up. And I'll tell you where this really comes from. And I think the pandemic really surfaced this when the student athletes got together behind the Clemson quarterback and said, hey, we're going to play. Yeah, COVID-19 is out there, but we're done sitting on the sidelines, and we want to play. And so I think that the pandemic has created some leadership in the students, which I think is a good thing, by the way, because I think that keeps the universities on their toes and keeps everybody talking. I think number one. Number two, my theory on this too is that a big part of the complaint is it's okay for you to put me on the front cover of an EA Sports video game and I don't get any money for it. You do. Now that's a different question. If you're going to use me to market and make money off of me marketing, then I think that the player should get a cut because that player is being used to sell something. Now, when they play a bowl game and they win the bowl game, should they get compensated? Heck, they do. They receive close to $10,000 to $15,000 in product. I've got friends that have gone to bowl games with the University of Texas. They come out with a ring that's worth $2,000 to $3,000. They come out with whatever. So whoever's sponsoring that bowl, they will get a treasure chest. Sometimes $1,000 watches, $1,000 Blu-ray players, $1,000 headsets. I mean, that's what nobody else is talking about. You make a bowl game, you are receiving some form of compensation, and it's in the form of generally physical, commercial advertisers providing those products to those student athletes. And it's not just the student athletes, it's everybody. It's
like winning an Oscar, right? You get the basket of goodies.
That's right. Okay. And the athlete gets the same thing. You don't make a bowl game, you don't get that, right? So why aren't we calling that compensation? And so my theory is this, is that you don't compensate an amateur athlete. We keep them amateur athletes. They know they're going to college to play college football, not getting paid, but hopefully getting to go to school for free, right? Because they're doing all this extra time, and it does take a lot of time. But if you're going to use a college athlete to sell something like an EA sports game, then yeah, I think they should get a royalty for it. That's not compensation. That is, hey, you're using me to sell, and I should be compensated for that.
Well, I had a feeling you would have some opinions about it. So, thank you, John Payton, for being on. Just let me do a little promo for the fact that you and I are going to do a health and wellness podcast starting in July. I'm really looking forward because I have a feeling you and I could fill up hours talking about our experiences in staying sane and with health and wellness. So, thank you for being on today. Time's already up.
It is.
Talking
I'm
to
going to
you.
let you finish out. Just a quick excerpt. You're going to want to tune in. I'm letting this go now on Dr. Good's show. JP's Kitchen will be firing off, and we'll be talking JP's Kitchen on the show.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
So, all right, I'm going to tune out and let you finish out, Dr. Good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. As always, time goes by quickly when we're talking about public education and the current events around it. Thanks for being on today. I hope that all of you left sort of a little bit more informed about what's going on, and that you're becoming stronger advocates for public education. As you know, we need to make sure that we graduate our kids into high-paying jobs, not hourly wage ones. It benefits us in the long run as well. So thank you for your time today. I hope the rest of your day is great, and we'll see you back again next week. Thank you, everyone.